All right, hey nerds. So, gonna continue my series on Richard Rorty and Gianni Vattimo's The Future of Religion. And so I'll have to explain some concepts here. For those of you who haven't watched my videos before, pragmatism is a philosophy in which truth is measured based on how practically applicable a claim or theory is in real life. An example would be this car works, I try it, it starts and runs. So, to a pragmatist, this means that the car works, and it is true that the car works. Richard Rorty is an atheist pragmatist, and Gianni Vattimo is a contemporary Catholic philosopher. Rorty and Vattimo wrote The Future of Religion. They talk about the famous 1800s existentialist philosopher who everyone knows about, Nietzsche, who went insane later in life, infamously, of course. So, to oversimplify, existentialism says you choose your own meaning in life, and Nietzsche's existentialism sometimes gets conflated with nihilism. Sometimes people falsely accuse Nietzsche of being a nihilist. But in both existentialism and nihilism, they conclude that there's no objective meaning in life. The difference is that nihilists despair about the lack of meaning in life, while existentialists use the lack of meaning as a reason to choose your own meaning that works for you. The freedom to choose. Existentialists see the lack of meaning as the freedom to choose your own meaning. In the philosophy of religion, hermeneutics it basically means biblical interpretation or just interpretation in general. It can be interpretation of other texts and ideas or yeah, anything like that, but it's usually the Bible. And metaphysics is essentially the philosophical study and speculation about the cosmic nature, structure, and function of the universe long before astrophysics. Now, Rorty used hermeneutics or interpretation to create a religion without a metaphysical God by using a more pragmatic definition of truth. It's more useful for many people to follow a religion without strict rules and really specifically defined God. So the religion can still work for them even if they feel that they go against the logos or the divine word and order of God. We can discover the logos or the word of God through dialogue and reason, but without being obsessed or even necessarily caring much. Now, I've talked about John Locke before in my series I've been doing on his essay called "An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding," right? And he was a famous 17th century British Enlightenment philosopher. He hated academic pageantry, which I love about him, and he got interested in politics, science, and religion, as many Enlightenment philosophers obviously did. And so with Locke's empiricism, he basically says that what he calls understanding allows us to perceive other things, but it doesn't notice itself. Understanding is its own object. Understanding is a sort of idea separate from human consciousness. So we'll get into John Locke's empiricism and empiricism in general here. So he argued that all knowledge originates from experience, rejecting the idea of innate ideas, and that the mind is a blank slate at birth. That he's saying that the mind is a blank slate at birth. Locke's philosophy as an empiricist emphasizes that knowledge is derived from experience alone, not innate ideas or reason. And he had so basically Locke said that all knowledge comes from experience and that there are no innate ideas that are with us when we're born. At birth we are a blank slate, or as he called it, a tabula rasa, to be all pedantic and stuff in Latin. Okay, so we're gonna have to talk about review what historical materialism is too in Marx. So Marx's theory of historical materialism posits that history is driven by economic forces and class struggle. Marxists usually say history is driven by material factors, basically, like physical objects, products that we buy, physical things in our house, that sort of thing, or wherever we live. Uh, So history is driven by economic forces and class struggle, with social and political structures arising from the mode of production and the relations of production. And this is related to dialectical materialism. So Marx's theory of historical materialism is rooted in dialectical materialism, which posits that all things develop through material contradictions and that these contradictions cannot be harmonized through reason or divine power. So reason or the divine power of God cannot break these contradictions between material objects that are the base of historical materialism. So these contradictions cannot be harmonized through reason or divine power. Incompatible elements must oppose each other until adaptation or destruction takes place. Very historical materialism and dialectical materialism, very interesting ideas in relation to Marx, of course. So we're going to have to review what ontology is here, which is basically the branch of it's a separate branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being, or you could specifically oversimplify an ontology to basically what exists. Okay, so remember, I've talked about Heidegger many times before. He's a 20th century atheist philosopher who began developing intellectually as when he was training to become a Jesuit priest. But then some philosophers say he was an atheist, but then he kind of got more religious. It's hard to say. He kind of like was spiritual but not religious, but I don't think he would put it that way. In fact, he might have been disgusted by someone describing him that way. But you can kind of say he was an atheist. He's a 20th century atheist philosopher who did a lot of work on phenomenology and metaphysics. Heidegger studied being or Dasein. He uses a capital B because to him, being is a state. We pretty much inevitably look at being through the lens of our experience as beings with a small b. To Heidegger, we are beings experiencing being. Being is just a state, kind of like existence. Being would be even if there were no beings to be. There would be being even if there were no beings to experience being. To Heidegger, anyway, of course. Okay, so with that all in mind, we'll get into the paragraph here, so it's not confusing. Okay, so in this paragraph, in this paragraph in The Future of Religion. Okay, so the philosophical truth of hermeneutics, or we can say interpretation, namely its claim to be a more valid thought than other philosophies, for example, or to be a more truthful philosophy than neo-empiricism or historical materialism, etc., evidently cannot be maintained on the basis of a description of what, according to it, the state of affairs really is. Of course, verbose sentence there. So basically, he's saying that hermeneutics or interpretation cannot be cannot versus empiricism and historical materialism based we cannot figure out what best philosophical framework is for figuring out the true nature of reality based on what the state of reality is actually like. We can't figure out whether hermeneutics or empiricism or historical materialism is the best way to look at reality in terms of the way reality actually is. That, as Nietzsche writes, there are no facts, only interpretations, is not an objective metaphysical proposition. This proposition, too, is only an interpretation. So when Nietzsche said, there are no facts, only interpretations, this in itself was also an interpretation. If one reflects on the meaning of the statement, one realizes how much hermeneutics has indeed changed the reality of things and transformed philosophy. As is well known, Martin Heidegger, right from the beginning of his career, and then more and more consistently and deliberately in the subsequent elaboration of his thought, did not provide proofs for his propositions. Instead, he put them forth as responses to situations in which his thinking, he himself, found itself involved or thrown into. When we're born or we first come into being, we're thrown into it. He calls this thrownness. The existential analytic of being and time does not constitute a description of the nature and structure of human existence. It is already, in every sense, an interpretation. So when when Heidegger is describing the metaphysical nature or phenomenological nature of reality, it's his interpretation. I would say that all of philosophy is interpretation, basically. But yeah, that's true. And Heidegger, unlike other philosophers, is honest enough to actually admit that, I would say. So, anyway, the existential analytic of being and time does not constitute a description of the nature and structure of human existence. It is already, in every sense, an interpretation. That is to say, a listening and a replying to what we ourselves are, well we are, and entirely from within. If there is a difference between an early and a late Heidegger, a difference for that matter recognizable in Heidegger's own terminological usage because his terminology changes, it lies in an increasingly explicit awareness that being into which we are thrown and to which we respond from within is intensely characterized in historical terms. So basically, Heidegger came, according to Rorty, Heidegger came around to the opinion that being is rooted in historical materialism, which is very interesting because it's a much more materialist way of looking at reality than the way Heidegger usually usually does. But he might have been, because he's a philosopher and a lot of philosophers just like to be shit disturbers, he might have done that just simply to deconstruct uh, Nietzsche's opinion on metaphysics, basically, which I think he did. Thus, in late Heidegger, one seldom or never finds the term, basically the German word for authenticity. However, the etymological root eigen is still used to characterize the approaching event of being. This observation, which might seem reducible to the level of a mere lexical accident, expresses rather well the general meaning of the ontological, or what exists, ontological radicalization, or radicalization about what exists in being, undergone by hermeneutics in the development of Heidegger's thought. So basically, that's all how, in a nutshell, Heidegger used hermeneutics to reinterpret his definition of being in order to destroy Nietzsche's metaphysical description of reality and declare that metaphysics is based on historical materialism. So basically, this is all how, in a nutshell, uh, Richard Rorty basically, well, he didn't prove, but basically, uh, Heidegger corrupted being to destroy Nietzsche's reality. Yes, Heidegger corrupted being to destroy Nietzsche's reality.